Okay, hopefully that's coming through all right.
Yeah, looking good.
Looking good to me too. Yep.
Oh, I have to say I'm loving some of the backgrounds that people are getting creative with today. I'm sorry I'm quite gone as adventurous as that, but we shall see. We'll hopefully people will find it interesting and the concept that wins them over.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to it.
So I'm Nick. I work for a company, Biotech, and I'm based over in Bristol in the UK. So my role there, pretty much since I started out of university, has been as a developer, and that's gone on and now principal developer there. Also Sitecore MVP for I think about 10 years. Hopefully know at least some things about what we're going to talk about today. So the idea behind this talk was based off some work we did for Just Eat. So over in the UK, they're a big takeaway company. And I think it was probably about 15, 16 months ago, we started trying to bring some SEO content to their pages. So essentially providing a CMS that they could then use to do multilingual, multi-site, URL, multi-location deployment. So first up, we started with Razor. We knew Razor in-house. That was something that we had a lot of experience with. Probably about 6 months into the build, when we started working much closer with some of their internal teams, we found that they had a real appetite for front-end frameworks. So Vue was their big thing. So we thought, well, this is probably quite a good time to fork our approach and actually go with JSS. It was a good fit. We were actually tempted to use it from the very start, but because we knew we had a very tight deadline, at that point we decided not to. We then thought we'd roll out later down the line. So some of the problems that we were trying to solve, we were dealing with numbers and numbers of content. So 40,000 nodes doesn't necessarily work that well on Sitecore. You can get it to work, you can use buckets, but a tree structure is probably slightly cumbersome for that kind of thing. So instead, we went for a CSV-based approach where we could import all this stuff and then share it out across all the different pages that we do. And so really what the idea behind today's talk is to share how we went about doing some of that, some of the approaches we took, how JSS can lend itself to that sort of thing, how it makes some of that slightly more difficult, and what your customization options are. So really, how do you work with it as a developer? I think it's probably worth mentioning just before we go any further that thank you to all the people arranging this, putting it on. It is a real shame that we couldn't have done it in Budapest back in the end of March. These sorts of things, the whole kind of social aspect, the networking is such a big thing. So yeah, hats off for them being able to put it on in kind of real short timeline virtually, and hopefully people will do it and get something out of it all. I know some of the talks I've seen have been, throughout the day have been really good. And actually, there's always scope for learning. So hats off to the community aspect. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover today. So first up, we're going to look at building a page using JSS. So how does Sitecore do that when you first install JSS? What does it look like? What's your sort of default go-to content that you get? Then a slightly different topic. So I'm sure there's lots of people here that have tried deploying Sitecore. Getting it into production can be slightly troublesome. I mean, I know that from our experiences, deployments don't always necessarily go smoothly because it's a complex system. There's all sorts of moving parts. You've got boxes doing delivery, you've got boxes doing processing, you've got XConnect, you add to the mixed commerce, and the whole thing is quite a difficult problem to just easily deploy out. So let's see how maybe if we use some techniques that we've got here, you can actually make changes where you don't need to deploy all the Sitecore. You can deploy a small little node app, which is pretty lightweight, probably can run on something like Linux. It's only going to be a few megabytes, so actually it's a lot easier to deploy than a big database that you need to back up and you make sure exists in all these places. So yeah, we'll go through that. Then we'll see how we can actually add custom data to this. So how can we make this stuff a bit richer? So Sitecore is one of the sources of data, but it doesn't have to be the only one. We could get data from Azure Functions. We could get data from Lambdas. We could get data from a database anywhere in the cloud, from an API anywhere that runs in the cloud. So what we'll see is how that kind of flows and glues together with the different options that JSS presents. Then I think it would be, it's great to be able to deploy this stuff and pull data from anywhere. But what if you need to make sure that your site is running as smoothly and as quickly and efficiently as you can? I'm sure people hate that call that they get when suddenly, oh no, the site's down, or the site's gone slow, or anything along those lines. So we'll see that how we can kind of layer in a few options into this to say, well, perhaps we can introduce caching or ways to manage this data throughout the flow to ensure that it's all as performant and efficient as possible. And then finally, in order to achieve that, you need to be able to see what's going on, don't you? You need to know where this data lives, what's going on with all of the infrastructure that's running. So how do you monitor it? How do you get a good feel for what's going on with JSS? What's going on with all the system that you're running? So here's the first sort of pages that we started building for Just Eat. So mainly it was around search content. So for example, here we can see Indian food within just Indian takeaways. Now, the reason that this suddenly grew in terms of the content was we then covered Indian food, Chinese food, KFC, Indian food in Bristol, Chinese food in Bristol, and so on. So you can see the permutations of content just grew out and grew out. We touched on it before. We could have modeled that in SUGCON. We could have built this big tree structure, but it didn't really feel like quite the right fit. We were able to enrich these pages with content from SUGCON, but in reality, just getting it all from the get-go, it just wasn't the right way to solve this problem. So now as we start to look into what JSS is and what it can offer, let's just consider the way that you would build a page if you were just dissecting it. So say you were building it in S6A, you were building it in MVC, you were building it in JSS. That's just that, they're the technology behind it. The way that you dissect the page will kind of lead us towards the way that we want to think about the content and the data. So you've got your typical header footer. That's pretty standard in sites with breadcrumbs. Yeah, most sites will have that kind of thing. Then let's think about components. So any site called build, you will probably build sub layouts, you'll build renderings, you'll build, however you choose to model the data and to display it, will then get dropped into placeholders, and that can be personalized. I mean, that's kind of what you get taught SUGCON 101. Now, something that I think with, at least with this build, is we were then actually consuming components that the Just Eat guys themselves bought. So they made. So, for example, the search box is something that we get through an install. So we just deploy that as part of our application. All the functionality lives within their build. However, we can then send SUGCON content into it in order to enrich it, to make it work multilingual, to make it work across all the different sites they do. Now, a bit of a homage to the fact that we were supposed to be in Budapest. If you were to look up Hungarian food on their site, then it defaults to fish and chips, which kind of shows some of the behavior that we had to put, but we haven't got content specifically for every location, for every kind of regional version of food, because the content entry effort would be so high. So there's default imagery and content that if anyone's hungry, I guess you could probably reach out to these guys now, and hopefully you might end up getting some food just towards the end of the talk. But yeah, let's move on. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about data and we're talking about content. Now, the two I think you could probably consider as being much the same in this kind of scenario. And I apologize if you can hear any screaming. My 4-month-old baby is just having his bath, so it's bedtime, doesn't always go the smoothest, so just bear with us. So yeah, data and content. They're the same if we're arguing about where they come from. So if API serving this stuff from a system that runs in the cloud, the two are pretty analogous. So Now, I think this diagram hopefully is something that lots of people before and will understand. This is probably the most basic cycle deployment that you could get. You've got your delivery nodes, you've got your web database, probably running out of PaaS in Azure if you're going with the out-of-the-box setting. This is probably your default source of content within JSS deployment. Now, if we want to take the idea a bit further and explore things a bit more, this would be a cool way to get your content. It can't be the fastest, I imagine, and probably for capacity-wise, I can't imagine you're going to be able to get much onto a floppy disk, but it's feasible. I kind of like this idea a bit more. What if we actually took things a bit more organic? I mean, I'd be very interested to see if anyone was able to get some content out of the potato into their cycle site, but maybe that's a good challenge for the next SUGCON to see what creative sources of information people can pull on. In reality, these are probably a bit more likely. Things in the cloud, so Lambdas, Azure Functions, Google Cloud Functions, all of those kind of things are where really I think aggregating data that you send into your application becomes a lot more relevant and it's a much more common use case. So this diagram really is aiming to just demonstrate the flow that we've got from the left-hand side, where we can see we've got the sources of data, whether they be Sitecore, the layout service, GraphQL endpoint, whether they be a serverless function, a system that you don't even know where it lives. Now, one thing that I was just going to point out about this diagram, I'll just find my little pen, is that the data doesn't necessarily have to flow this way. Some of the options that we'll look at today actually will explore the data running up from the serverless functions layout service and then onto the streaming app. Now, for a front-end developer, we just can the content through a fetch, an Axios call, whatever that might be within React, within Vue, within Angular. That's absolutely fine. The focus really that we're going to look at today is around how we can bring this data up through the layout service and through Sitecore so that it can act as a kind of proxy to these external systems. We'll see some of the technologies that are involved in that and how you configure it, and then how you can do it potentially without really needing to deploy stuff. Now, hopefully people have at least seen JSS running. If people caught Anastasia and Mark's talk earlier, that gave a really good feel for the pros and the cons and the challenges that each come with. When you first install the layout service and JSS into your app, you do get a certain amount available to you. You also then can spin up the starter kits that they mentioned within seconds. I mean, it's 4 command line calls, and you've got a React app running, you've got a Vue app running. Now, it takes a little bit more to glue that together actually with Sitecore, because you've got to wire the two together. You've got to connect your React app through some configuration to the Sitecore backend. You need to make sure certain things are set up in the two. But once they're there, it's actually quite a simple thing to start serving custom data through the whole system. So some of the kind of terminologies or some of the approaches that Sitecore have taken are this middle column that we can see. So things like context extensions, they're things that are probably more suited to headers and footers, that kind of thing. Content resolvers and the next two down, chained ones and dynamic ones, they become interesting when you want to try and get a bit more power or a bit more control out of your resolvers. You can think of them a bit more like normal components, normal sublayouts, normal rendering. And then finally, GraphQL. That makes things even more interesting because you don't really necessarily have to control the shape of the data at the Sitecore end. You can control the shape of the data when you consume it. So let's work through a few of these and we'll just see what it looks like to create one. We'll see the limitations of them, a few caveats that we found as we have started using them within our deployment, and where they best suit the deployment. So first up, content resolvers. These are probably your most basic or your first start point for really getting content into your JSS app. So you need to do a couple of things. You need to create a JSON rendering. So that's normal site call behavior. You go into the tree and create one. Then you've got a couple options. You have to attach what's called a resolver. Either you can use one of the out-of-the-box ones. So an out-of-the-box one will say, get me everything from data source, or it might say, get me every field from the item that we're on, or it might say, get me the children, and list the fields out on the children. Let's assume that you're going with the custom approach. So for a custom approach, you need to write a bit of C# code. You need to inherit from this rendering content resolver, plug it all together, publish it, and there you go. Within your custom code, you can go off and you can query as many items as you want, make API calls, you can do whatever you feel right within C#. The flexibility exists there. Because they get added to the page through the normal site call presentation details, you then can also make use of things like the HTML cache. So you can add things like vary by data, vary by user, vary by param, all the good stuff that people will be used to from building essentially normal MVC cycle sites. So let's summarize those. Content resolvers, yes, they need a deployment, assuming that you're customizing things. You need to write some code, and you need to change some content. Okay. So then next up, context extensions. Now, their use case is probably more suited to things like headers and footers, navigation, breadcrumbs, all those kind of things that get used every single page that you run. Meta information, those kinds of things. Again, they don't really take much to set up. You have to inherit from the processor that you can see there. You need to add a bit of config, and we'll have a look at that in a minute and just see it in action. Now, it's probably worth mentioning one thing that we got caught out by with these is that they don't have caching in them. So for example, we wanted to put the header onto every single page. Kind of makes sense. Every single time that the context extension ran, it would have to do all the work to get all the site core items, to look them up in the different areas of the tree, to go and find the information to show, even though every single page had the same header and had the same footer on. So we did start a conversation with Cam and the guys about just, was this the right thing to do? Had we gone about things in the wrong way? So they mentioned, well, they're not going to introduce caching within the layout service, which is fair enough, because they said, well, maybe you should think about using GraphQL. Now, GraphQL allows you to go off and get all of this data from all these different places, and then actually within the Apollo aspect of the React app, the Vue app, that will get cached. So therefore, as you move through a single page app, you don't have to go off and get the data every single time because you've got that single store of it. Unfortunately, in our scenario, we weren't able to use the single page app approach across all the pages because some of the pages ran off just the normal site, their existing application. Some of them ran off MVC that we built. Some of them ran off Vue that we built for JSS. So I think our scenario, that didn't really the GraphQL approach didn't really work for us. So what we actually did was we introduced some custom caching in there just to solve the problem. Now, when we went to do that, we managed to drop the number of CD boxes we were running by half, possibly because some of the way we'd done some of the queries wasn't optimum. So a combination of caching them and making sure that what we were doing in them was fast meant we then got much better performance out of the layout service. So these guys, what's the deployment aspect of this? Well, yes, you do need to deploy them. You do need to deploy to roll out changes to this. They need config changes, which kind of say which application in, various other ways of filtering them, and then you need the code, so the C# code and the DLLs. I'm hoping that people have got at least a bit of knowledge or experience of what the layout service is. We'll see it in action in a sec, but to give a sort of top level summary, your front end single page app, your JSS app, makes a call back to Sitecore to get some content, some JSON. So within that JSON are things like the context that we saw, so the header and footer information, the meta information. You then have all the components for the page nested with their respective placeholders. So what the JSS SDK does is actually glue all of that together with your custom components that you've built in React or Vue or Angular and fill the page out. Now, if you want to introduce some kind of, I guess, flexibility or variability in those calls back to Sitecore, things that you can do are append query strings, so you can put site in if you need. If you saw the SXA versus JSS talk, they did highlight a few reasons why that's slightly more tricky. And the way we went about that was to introduce a little bit of logic into our front end app that said, I recognize that I'm your xyz.co.uk, therefore I need to pass through a specific site name, so website UK. If I spot that the URL is xyz.ie, so the Irish version, then I pass through a different site parameter. So it took a little bit of customization to kind of get all of that playing nicely together. It doesn't feel like it's the best solution to the problem, but it did mean that we could then operate multi-site without really too much complexity within Sitecore. Sitecore was just operating normally. It was serving up the site it was told to. Now, the key part of the way that a JSS request will work is the root. That's the page that you're on, the item. And so this gets formed by the JSS application itself. It creates the query string based on the URL that it reads, and then it will send that back to the layout service. And this is how Sitecore then chooses which item to resolve. Similarly, if you've got a language little chunk in the URL, so /en/ whatever the page URL is, that can get fed through to sclang. And actually, if you really wanted to, you could make use of SE database. I think that's probably a rarer scenario because most of the time you would be running off the web database when you're in production. But there are certain circumstances where that exists and it will work for you. So content resolvers, they a bit like components. They are, think of them like your sub layout, think of them like your rendering that you would make in traditional Sitecore. They work by taking the resolver. The resolver is kind of the logic and the rules that say where to go and get the data from. But they can have one, so that's fine. There's no problem with the fact that they can get one. However, what if you want to get data from multiple items, or you want to use rendering parameters to aggregate things? Now, if you find you're in that position, it's quite an easy problem to solve. Before data gets sent to the actual JSON layout service endpoint, it runs through some logic and some code within the Sitecore DLLs that makes use of JObjects. Now, if you've worked with JObjects and you need to combine two of them, it's actually much more simple than you would think. They have a merge option. So you can take the data that you get from the existing resolver, and then you can bolt on extra bits or merge in extra bits from wherever you need to. And what we'll do is we'll have a quick look at a demo of that just to kind of show a scenario where that was useful for us. This is probably a more unlikely scenario for most, but it goes to show it was trivial to do. And if you hit that problem, then you've got a few options. So chain content resolvers. Do you need a deployment? Well, if you're making changes that are more than just configuring them, you probably will do, because they require some cycle code or some C# code, sorry, and some content. So yes, you probably need a deployment. Okay, so let's have a look at a demo. The demo gods will undoubtedly have some influence on this. Think of them as a little drone flying into the demo, which is the crash test dummy. Okay. So first up, I've got pretty much a stock 9.3 install here, and all I've done is install the cycle JSS package in there. So it's pretty out of the box. For the actual front end React app that we'll have a look at, that's pretty much just fired up from npm and creating a new one. The few customizations I'll point out as we go so that people have a feel for the sort of thing that you might need to do. So if we think of the most basic content resolver that we want to do, you need to create an item within the tree. So you need to create it within the modules, and then the layout service, and then the resolvers, and you can choose your folder structure after that. And really all that's doing is it's just pointing the resolver at some code. It's pointing it at C# code. When you then go in and create your actual rendering, let's just pull up an example. Alongside the normal the normal cycle fields that you need to fill in, pick a content resolver. You pick what to link to. So when you then choose to render that to the page, you're in control with C# of what you actually see and what happens behind the scenes. So if we were to have a look at what that looks like, you have to inherit from this rendering content resolver. That comes with something that you need to override. As part of that, you get extra information, so you can pull out parameters from here. You can gather all sorts of useful information from the rendering. So that's quite a common object to have a look in and a dig through, because it will tell you what the rendering, sort of almost like the context of what's going on at the time. And then finally, you return an object. So it could be something hard coded. It could be something that looks up data within Sitecore. It could be something that goes off, takes some information out of the parameters, so an external URL to go and get information from, make a call to that, and then get the data and return the content. If you're doing that, I would say always put a timeout on there, because sometimes these sorts of things will fail. Don't necessarily expect system X, Y, and Z to always be running. That's something that we've been caught out by. Things like Poly are brilliant for that. You can put in circuit breakers, timeouts, retries, you name it. This is quite a simple example, but yeah, bear with it. If we look at the other variation of what we saw before, then we're talking about context extensions. Now they're slightly different. They have to inherit from this processor that you can see and override a slightly different method. Ultimately, once they're running and in action, what you end up doing is you choose the name of the object that you're going to push back, and then you add data to it. So this could be your navigation, this could be your header, this could be your footer, it could be your meta information, you name it. And then finally, for these context extensions, you just need to patch them in. So rather than it coming from content, it comes from config. And using some of these restrictions, you can actually say this is only relevant to a certain application that you've got, or it might be a certain route is only relevant to do this on. So you get a lot of flexibility there. You could also build, I think, some of that logic into here. You could get the context item, and you could choose whether you want to return anything or not. So let's see what that actually looks like in terms of the layout service. So here we can see the URL. It's Sitecore API layout render JSS. We can see the item query string. So this is the root, and we're just on the home page here. We can see we're in English, and then an API key. So within the JSON that you've got, we can see a few things. We've got the context, and we've got the root. So first up, the context is probably the interesting one, and this is what we were just seeing. Here we can see we've got security info is anonymous true. So that's coming from the fact that we're saying security info is anonymous and then true. Then if we have a look at the root itself, we can see we've got placeholders, but we don't have anything in them yet. So now what we're going to do is we'll add in a component that just shows some basic content. So first up, let's go back to Sitecore and we'll have a look at why that's happening. So on my note that I've got, hopefully people will spot the issue. The issue really is that I've intentionally broken the placeholder name within Sitecore. So first up, let's just enable some of these. And if we come back here and refresh, what we should see is we've now got a component. We can see its name. So this is what the JSS app uses to glue the stuff together. And then we've got the fields and data that we set from Visual Studio. So if we have a look back at our basic one, here you go, here's the data. All quite basic so far. I think that's almost like your getting started approach to doing this. Now, this can get a bit more interesting if we start to bring in, for example, the proxy one. So let's have a look at the two proxy ones we've got. So first up, this one is going to go off to Azure, and this is going to call an Azure function and get some data back. And the second one is going to go off to AWS, and this is going to call a Lambda function and get some data back. So let's okay that. Let's actually see this running within a site. So here we've got a JSS starter kit, complete with Windows 98 theme, just to keep it nice and retro. So let's refresh this. And what can we see here? The basic resolver we saw before has now got the fields that we wrote within our C# code. And we've got a couple of issues here. Our Azure and Lambda have both timed out. So this time around, we can see that the Lambda has actually managed to serve some content. And I suspect if we do it again, what we'll hopefully see is both the Azure functions giving us some content and the Lambda functions giving us some content. Now, just to give you an idea of what they look like, if we just call one of those, let's just show that in a browser, just to prove it. There you go. So that's running out of Azure. Hopefully this is showing the flexibility that can come with the layout service. We've seen it within a page, within a React app that runs and shows this stuff. If we refresh the layout service, we can see similar things here. We've got the configuration of it, and then we've got the actual results. The fun part, or the really useful part of using these components in this way is that you can HTML cache them. You can make use of normal Sitecore behavior to kind of give you better performance as these things scale and grow and more data gets served. So one of the things that we had to do with the Just Eat project was we had to serve up, I think it was about 500 locations in one request. So if we didn't cache that, we're not going to get particularly good performance for having to look it up every time. So what we were able to do is cache it in certain ways, which we'll see slightly later, to get much better performance. The final thing we'll look at now is the one that chains them. This gives you the flexibility to read rendering parameters. And so the way that we approached things here was we said, well, if you've gone in and set a related item within the content, what we can then do is go off and get the item related to that, pull the fields together, and then finally merge them at the end before we send it back to the client. It's quite a simple example. We took the idea a bit further in our actual deployment, but hopefully it gives a feel for what that looks like. Now, it's worth mentioning all the code that we've got here. It's all up on GitHub. It's public. I'll share the URL slightly later. So yeah, don't worry about copying or anything like that. You'll be able to get access to it later on. All right. So this is quite a big claim, I think. 0 Sitecore deployments. Now, I think this is quite an aspirational thing in reality, because I would argue that even if you're deploying changes that kind of represent schema changes, they come with an element of risk, because ultimately you have a contract. You've got the layout service with the fixed fields in, and you've got your front end app that consumes this stuff. Those two things kind of need to be aligned. However, with some of the approaches we'll look at now, you can kind of bend that a little bit. And I think this is a really interesting one to see how people are approaching this out in the wild, because we made a quite conscious decision that we wanted to deploy it in a certain way. We wanted to make it safe as possible, because even 10 seconds of downtime is not acceptable for some of the clients we work with. Just the financial impact of that is huge. So we had to come up with a very, very safe way. I think if you're taking a slightly different approach, then some of these things might suit you slightly more. So first up, Cycle gives you GraphQL if you want to use it. So you have to turn on an endpoint which exposes GraphQL to the internet, and for certain reasons that was one of the choices that we made, was not to use it because we didn't want to do that. You need to create a JSON rendering, so much like we saw before, but rather than attaching a resolver, what you then do is you attach the query, or you embed the query in that item. So integrated GraphQL, does it need a cycle deployment? No, because we're just dealing with content. So that's quite a nice, I think that's a very positive sell. It also gives quite a lot of flexibility. It means that the design of the system can be a bit more dynamic. It's not fixed around C# code that defines that schema. There are pros and cons there. That's down to how you want to implement things, not how the system allows you to. Now, connected GraphQL is a slightly different variation to that idea. What you do is you configure the endpoint, you turn it on, and then rather than designing the queries and hosting them within Cycle itself, you put them at the client. So for example, your React app can say, this is the GraphQL query I want to run, sends it back to the endpoint, and the endpoint gives back the data. And there's a huge amount of positive gains that can come from the fact that you're using GraphQL. There's all sorts of clever caching options that exist there. It can do lots of query optimizations. You can customize the way GraphQL works. So I think it's a really good option if people there are confident at writing the queries, if people there are confident about the way and the options that security around it is. So it's a good fit for some people. I think if you've got a team of developers who are very, very front-end focused, then probably something like this will mean that they're a lot more efficient and enabled to develop, because there's no dependency on, I say, back-end Cycle developers. So connected GraphQL, does it need a deployment? No. Does it need cycle changes? No, because all this stuff lives in your Node app, within your React Vue app, Angular app. Now, we decided that we didn't really want to expose the GraphQL endpoint. What we wanted to do was build something, a bit of a hybrid of the two. So we created this kind of concept of a dynamic content resolver. It's probably about 15 classes, so it's not a huge amount of code. It's quite simple. It was meant to be quite simple. It doesn't, we've accepted the fact it doesn't have all the caching that GraphQL will have in it. It's not as feature rich as GraphQL. However, it gives us some quite simple behavior. We can chain these kind of statements together, which allow us to go off and pull data from data sources, from specific items, from items and their children, from items where we want to turn field names from one thing into another. We can go off and get linked items, related items, you name it. So to get this deployed out into the wild would obviously take a deployment, but after that, it's really then down to content. So what you do is you set a parameters query that can define the behavior that you want to see, and then that will influence the behavior that you get at the front end. All right, so let's have a look at some of this stuff running. Now, let's think of the demo gods as being the ball bearing in this, and my demo as being the Tesla car. Let's see it running. Okay. So first up, the dynamic demo that we just touched on. So what we do is we make use of this parameters field that allows us to define where we want to get the data, how we want to get the data, how we want to kind of remap it or shape it. It's all quite straightforward. The reason that this is quite nice is it actually plays very fair with page editor, with experience editor, because you're dealing with cycle fields rather than kind of cherry picking things that some other approaches allow you to. Sorry, wait a sec. And then if we have a look at the GraphQL demo, you can see here that we've got the query embedded against the JSON rendering. So what we're saying here is, right, we'll go off and get content from the home node, and we'll pull the text field out. So both are kind of doing similar things, just in slightly different ways. So let's go and turn them on. So let's make the placeholders correct. So first up, the dynamic one. Okay, if we refresh this guy, what we can see here is we've got our dynamic demo. We're getting content from something that's set on the home node in the JSS. So this is coming from one item in the tree. We've got content coming from another item in the tree that just happens to have arbitrary example fields on it. And we're also taking content from the home item that ships with the default Sitecore installation. So if we want to just see that running, here you go. We can see we've got content from somewhere arbitrarily in the tree. We've got content from somewhere else arbitrarily in the tree. And that's all driven off content, which I think is really quite neat. Now, the GraphQL approach is actually very similar. It allows you to construct these queries that go off and get the data from wherever they might want to in the tree. So if we have a look at that in the scope of the page, here we go. We can see we've said take the text field off the home item, and that was driven off the query we had within Sitecore. So now, just to prove that we're not making all this up, we've got the dynamic one, which was the custom code we've done, and then we've got the GraphQL version. That's pretty neat. We're starting to give some real good flexibility now to editors, I guess. Maybe you might not want to give editors that full freedom, because if they go in and start messing about with the queries, that could have pretty bad knock-on effects. So if the query changed to remap what the fields were called, that's probably not the best approach, because your front end would have to be very, very safe against that. It would have to guard against all those scenarios. So it suits some solutions. I would see these more as kind of developer-owned operations. Okay. So hopefully people will recognize the significance of this slide. If you've not seen Spinal Tap, check it out. It's a very good film. It's a good parody of rock and roll and that kind of mockumentary film. Why is this important? Why is this relevant to us? We touched on it before. The sort of sites that we've been building, if they have 10 seconds of downtime, we get calls about it. We get production incidents which tell us the site's down or there's issues. If latency goes up, even for 5 seconds, we'll get alerted to it. Now, some of the work we've had to do is actually spending a lot of time with Azure to focus on why web apps restart when you don't expect them to. That's probably a topic for a different talk, but there's a lot of work that has to be done to just ensure that they're as resilient and as sturdy as possible. So that's where focusing on caching, I think, is a really important thing. And one thing that's very nice about the whole JSS deployment, about the whole structure and the whole way it's built, is it's very obvious where some of these seams exist. So where the boundaries lie between the data that you've got on one side and the consuming app the other. So first up, and this was our sort of start approach to how we would introduce caching to this. We put a layer in front of the layout service to say, cache the result of it. It's just JSON. That's quite simple. We need to vary it by certain things. We need to vary it by the root, obviously, by the language, by the site, and a couple other parameters. When we publish, we decache it. That's great. So this is a cache that we actually hold within Sitecore itself, within the delivery node. Now, you might argue that personalization falls over with that design. So what we've done to solve that is we've actually moved personalization into the View app so it can actually all run as we need it to. Now, that doesn't necessarily suit everyone's needs. I think some of the talk that Alex Schieber might be doing later is around the way that they've done some work around this, which I think ties in a similar way. And you have to roll out custom code for that. It's not out the box. So that approach probably doesn't suit everyone, but this is how we went about solving it. You can actually introduce caching within the SSR, within the View app or the React app. So this is quite a nice trick we employ to say, well, if, for example, Sitecore goes down for the 10 seconds, 20 seconds because the app services are restarting, what we do is we just store a little cached version of the content of the layout service call in the Node app so that we can use that if we get 500s from Sitecore. Now, I know that sounds like quite an edge case. You shouldn't be getting 500s from Sitecore. It should be working. But our experience of seeing this out in the wild is that that's not always the case. You can't guarantee the fact that an app service will be up 24/7 and hit the SLAs that we needed to get. Another option is you could introduce caching in front of the Node app. So you could use a CDN, you could put Akamai, you could put in Cloudflare, whatever it might be. Or you could do some caching at the browser, at the actual consumer end. So if you're running a single page app rather than the SSR, you could do the caching of the data there in the client, in the browser. If you're building a progressive web app, you could cache the data in the browser.
We're running short of time, so if you want to start wrapping it up.
Yep, thanks for that. The only downside I'd say to this, the more places that you've got that data cached, the more places that you need to change it or decache it, sorry, when you make content changes. If the editor goes in and says, right, I'm going to edit the homepage content, say, welcome to my amazing site, you've got all these points throughout the flow of this where you need to make sure it's up to date. Another thing that it's really useful to make sure that you've got good visibility of is the seams of the system. So monitoring things like the numbers of 200 you're getting out of Sitecore, the number of 500s, the number of 400s, the request counts, how long requests are taking. Taking that idea further, you've then got the ability to monitor data going into your SSR. So you could say, well, it took me X number of milliseconds to get the layout service data. And you monitor that over time, and that should, in theory, stay flat. The SSR or the Node app will be running probably out of some infrastructure in the cloud, I'd imagine. So you're going to have load balancers there. Again, you monitor the 200s, the 400s, the 500s, the request counts, you name it. And then finally, the last place that it's just worth keeping an eye on is actually what's happening at the user end. So things like Datadog have a client browser, a client agent, sorry, that you can install. App Dynamics do. It's quite a common way to solve these sorts of problems. So finally, what does that look like when you're actually keeping an eye on this stuff? Now, I'm aware there's quite a lot of information here. The two key boxes, I'd say, are the bottom left two. So here we can see, very bottom left, we did a load test, or the client did a load test, which took us from, I think, probably about 3,000 requests per interval up to, say, about 18,000. Now, if you look at the graph above that, what's really nice about it is you've got a pretty steady average response time. So we can see that even under all of that load, we were able to serve things as we needed to. and it all ran smoothly. Even with the amount of data that we were pulling in for all of the variations of takeaways, of locations that were coming from backend systems, we don't even have access to. We just get a CSV file. So I think that's a good point to wrap up, really. The summary I hope people will take away from this is that you can get data from anywhere. Hopefully someone will find a way to do the potato, but that's a good challenge to the community. That it can come from a CSV, it can come from Sitecore, it can come from a cloud function. You name it, it doesn't really matter. It can flow through Sitecore, through the layout service, if that makes sense. It can go direct to the client app, if that makes sense. That's down to your design. I'd say that caching, you have to consider it, because if you don't, you just won't get good performance out of this whole system. There's so many moving parts there. It's absolutely critical to the design that you've got. And then finally, monitor the seams. There's these clear points in the app between Sitecore, the SSR, and the client. Make sure you know what's going on at those different points. Look out for problems, because that one will bubble all the way through if you're getting them at the back end. Now, if anyone wants to see the code,
we really have to wrap it up. We have barely 10 minutes
okay.
to wrap. So we could do the Q&A. If you have last thoughts and your final slides, you can show that, and then we can do the questions.
That's it. Yeah, that was the final slide, that one. So I was going to say, if people want to get in touch, that's how. And there is a breakout room if people want to chat about anything related to either these talks or anything else. Hopefully people are making use of it. And the big one, this is the important one, if you can help, because there are all sorts of problems at the moment for people around the world. This is a really nice way to be able to offer some help.
All right, nice job there, Nick.
Thanks.
The only question, we've only got one question here, and I think it was answered on one of your last slides. Somebody asking for the GitHub repo, so they can look into this.
So what I'll do after this is put a copy of the slides up on my blog and put a link to it and stuff like that. So yeah, it should be easy to get hold of, hopefully.
Awesome. Any other last minute questions from community?
Doesn't look like. No. Thank you so much,
No,
Nick. If there's anything, we'll pass it through.
Super. Well, thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you. Guys, again, just to reiterate, we have a breakout room where you can jump in, talk to others, discuss the conference and anything Sitecore if you like. Also, cannot stress enough for the donations. My friend, Mr. Edwards, requested to read out a few names of people who've donated so far to help others get the encouragement. So I'll read a few for now. So Mr. Golden, Ben Golden, Corey, Mo, Richard, or Rick. I don't know why he is Richard for that one. Srikant, Kalina, Mr. Wilkerson, Aaron Bickle, Kenneth Gray, Mohammed, Grace Hussain, Kalyan, Nitin, Rob, LM, Arun Kumar, Ashish Bansal, Rob Riley, Kayur Karala, I think, Ketan, and Masood. We'll read some more names probably the next time we put that up, but we can't stress enough how important it is. So anything you can afford, please do donate to this great cause. It goes to all the healthcare workers and is run through WHO.
And we're at almost 4,000 euros. So
yep. And again, make sure you ask your questions. The more the questions, the better you could engage the speaker in and hopefully get some more answers. Usually they throw in additional info along with answering the question, so go ahead and do so. The next session we have is return of the painless sitecore deployment. So let's see what these two gentlemen, Sebastian and Per, have. Are you guys both online? If you are, can you share your webcams, please?
Hey, I'm here. I don't have a webcam.
Oh, who's
But
that? Is
So
that?
isn't that automatic disqualification?
Yeah, let's kick
Sorry.
Per out.
Sebastian, I think you're muted.
Yeah. Sebastian, you promised me that he's going to
Thank
have
you.
a webcam.
Thank you. I have a webcam, unfortunately for the rest of you guys.
But I thought you promised me that Per is going to have a webcam too when we did the testing.
Yeah, he's not so good at listening always.
So should we listen to him when he tells us about painless sitecore deployment?
Yeah, I think that's wise.
Maybe.
I would do so.
And how are you guys doing?
I'm holding up good, looking forward to presenting.
Have you had a chance to see any of the presentations?
Yes, I've been in watching here and there on several
Anything
of
which
the.
caught your eye?
I think that there have been many good. I have liked some of the ones around the marketing automation part of Sitecore.
Mhm.
I think it's great to see that there are coming more and more good stuff on the conferences on these parts, because it is a thing that that really could use more attention in the entire landscape, I think.
Yeah.
So.
When
And
sorry, go on.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, it's a lot it can already do, but I think just the capability of what you could do with it, if you add more capability to it, is what amazes me.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah, but that's always the phase 2 stuff, though, right?
it never happens.
Yeah, this is why it needs to be pushed to phase 1, because exactly it won't happen if you if you postpone it.
Yeah.
All the ideas are laid out in phase 1 and then never executed in phase 2.
Yeah. All right. We have a couple more minutes. I'll read a few more names, but it looks like we are just over 4,000 euros, which is great. So a few more names: Anis Chauhan, Cam Roos, George Tucker, Venugopal Vadla, Mihaela Radu, Mark Lowe, Andrew Perry, Walter Roll, bunch of anonymous donations. So obviously I don't have a name to read. Eva Denboros, RAC Hermison, Chandra Venkatraman, Dan Soloway, Linus Wieland, Alexander Sheba, the relative of Mr. Alex Sheba, or that's probably,
Alexander.
oh, that is Alex. Okay, this is Alexander. Trogel, James Williamson, Shelley, Erwin Rees, Aaron Metz, Erwin Workman, Ethel Crosby, Kariga, Chirag Patel, Mike Edwards, Saurabh Sachdeva, Gabriel, and Alexei. Oh, Alexei. All caps, Alexei. Come on, jeez. I was like, what is this? Alexei. So that's all the list. And like I said, there's a whole bunch of anonymous donations. So please donate as much as you possibly can. Sebastian and Per, who's going to be presenting so we can set you as the presenter?
I think you were muted.
Yeah, again.
I will start.
All right. Let me give that to you. Then we'll make sure you're on the right screen before we drop off.
something
Yep, we
should come up,
see
hopefully.
your command prompt and now the
Yeah, we
edit
see
mode
your,
of your PowerPoint. Oh, there you go.
yeah,
Perfect.
there you go.
And you see command prompt now and so forth.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.